Hello everyone and welcome to Palette Gaming. Today we are going to compare our Ryzen 5 5600G, which is a 6-core 12-thread Zen 3 CPU, versus our Ryzen 7 2700X, which is an 8-core 16-thread Zen Plus CPU paired with an RTX 3080 Ti 12GB graphics card in order to give the CPUs the room they need to stretch their legs and show us what they are capable of. We are using an MSI X470 Gaming Plus motherboard, 2 sticks of 8GB of DDR4 RAM clocked at 3200 MHz for a total of 16GB, a 512GB SSD for the operating system, and a 2TB hard drive for our games. For our test, we will be using a mix of synthetic benchmarks and 9 demanding AAA titles to answer the question: how much of a performance difference is there between a 5600G and a 2700X? And is it worth it to pair any of these budget CPUs with a high-end GPU like an RTX 3080 Ti? We'll start first with the synthetic benchmarks. With the exception of IDA64 CPU Queen, where the 2700X scored a win due to its higher core count, 5600G is faster than 2700X in all synthetic CPU tests. Its single-core performance is 37% higher, and while both CPUs offer similar multi-core performance, Ryzen 5 5600G is still marginally ahead, which is quite impressive and shows how powerful is AMD's Zen 3 microarchitecture. In 3D Mark Time Spy, both CPUs perform similarly, but 5600G is still a bit faster, with the only exception being the CPU score, where the 2700X scored its second and last win over the 5600G due to its higher core count. Next, we're running Unigine Heaven 4 at ultra extreme settings, and 5600G is 11% faster than 2700X at 1080p, generating 222 FPS versus 200 FPS for the 2700X. At 4040p, 5600G is just 3% faster, generating 148 FPS versus 144 FPS for the 2700X. At 4K, 5600G is only 4% faster than 2700X, generating 74 FPS versus 71 FPS for the 2700X. All in all, both CPUs perform very similarly in this test, and they can both fully utilize the GPU for the most part, even at 1080p. Next, we move to our gaming benchmarks, starting with Assassin's Creed Odyssey. We are running the built-in benchmark at ultra-high settings, and at 1080p, 5600G is 24% faster, but neither of the CPUs managed to max out the GPU. At 4040p, 5600G is 20% faster and maxes out the card, generating 88 FPS versus 73 FPS for the 2700X that still can't fully utilize the GPU and hovers around 85% GPU utilization. At 4K, both CPUs can fully utilize the GPU, but 5600G is still 10% faster, generating 65 FPS versus 59 FPS for the 2700X. Next, we move on to Cyberpunk 2077. First, we're running the built-in benchmark at ultra settings with ray tracing and DLSS disabled. At 1080p, 5600G is 31% faster and maxes out the GPU for the most part, while 2700X can't fully utilize the card. At 4040p, both CPUs can fully utilize the GPU, and 5600G is 8% faster. At 4K, the game is GPU bound and both CPUs perform identically, with the difference being within the margin of error. Next, we are running the built-in benchmark with ray tracing set at ultra and DLSS set at auto. At 1080p, 5600G is a whopping 40% faster and maxes out the card for the most part. At 4040p, 5600G is 31% faster, while 2700X still can't fully utilize the card. At 4K, both CPUs can fully utilize the GPU, and 5600G is 10% faster. What is interesting to note here is that ray tracing was very taxing on the CPU as well, affecting its performance quite significantly. Next, we are running the built-in benchmark in F1 2020 at ultra settings. At 1080p, 5600G is 26% faster, and even though GPU utilization is around 50% in both cases, both CPUs perform exceptionally well, generating over 135 FPS for the 2700X and 170 FPS for the 5600G. At 4040p, 5600G is 23% faster, generating over 165 FPS versus 134 FPS for the 2700X. At 4K, 5600G is 19% faster, generating over 155 FPS versus 130 FPS for the 2700X, but neither of our CPUs can max out the card. This game is CPU bound, and the RTX 3080 Ti is just overkill for F1 2020, as both of our CPUs bottleneck the card. Next, we are running the built-in benchmark in Far Cry New Dawn at ultra settings. At 1080p, both CPUs perform almost identically, and 5600G is marginally ahead, only 4% faster, while GPU utilization is lower than 50% in both cases. At 4040p, we have almost the same performance, we still have low GPU utilization for both CPUs, and 5600G is again only 4% faster than 2700X. The situation doesn't change at 4K, we have roughly the same FPS from both CPUs, 5600G is only 5% faster, and GPU utilization hovers around 70% in both cases. This is another case of a CPU-bound game at ultra settings, and both of these CPUs bottleneck the RTX 3080 Ti. Next, we are running the built-in benchmark in Forza Horizon 4 at ultra settings. At 1080p, 5600G is 29% faster, but neither of the CPUs can max out the GPU. Still, they both perform very well, generating over 124 FPS for the 2700X and 160 FPS for the 5600G. At 4040p, 5600G is 26% faster, generating over 156 FPS versus 123 FPS for the 2700X. At 4K, 5600G utilizes the GPU fully and is 10% faster than 2700X that cannot max out the RTX 3080 Ti even at 4K. In any case, both CPUs perform very well, giving us more than 120 FPS even at 4K, making them suitable for high FPS gaming in Forza Horizon 4. Next, we are running the built-in benchmark in Hitman 3 at ultra settings. At 1080p, 5600G is 30% faster, but neither of the CPUs can max out the GPU. At 4040p, 5600G is 32% faster, generating over 167 FPS versus 126 FPS for the 2700X that cannot max out the card. At 4K, both CPUs can utilize the GPU fully, and 5600G is only 3% faster, generating 110 FPS versus 106 FPS for the 2700X. Next, we are running the built-in benchmark in Horizon Zero Dawn at ultra settings. At 1080p, 5600G is 33% faster, but neither of the CPUs can max out the GPU. At 4040p, 5600G is 27% faster, generating over 131 FPS versus 103 FPS for the 2700X that cannot max out the card. At 4K, both CPUs can utilize the GPU fully, and 5600G is only 6% faster, generating 85 FPS versus 80 FPS for the 2700X. Next, we are running the built-in benchmark in Red Dead Redemption 2 at ultra settings. At 1080p, 5600G is 16% faster, but neither of the CPUs can max out the GPU. At 1440p, 5600G is 8% faster, generating over 106 FPS versus 98 FPS for the 2700X. At 4K, both CPUs can utilize the GPU fully and perform exactly the same, generating 70 FPS. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a GPU-heavy game, and it shows. Last game we're going to test for today is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and we're running the built-in benchmark at ultra settings. At 1080p, 5600G is 32% faster, but neither of the CPUs can max out the GPU. At 1440p, 5600G is 28% faster, generating over 139 FPS versus 108 FPS for the 2700X. At 4K, both CPUs can utilize the CPU fully, and 5600G is 10% faster, generating 92 FPS versus 83 FPS for the 2700X. In conclusion, the RTX 3080 Ti is still one of the fastest video cards there is in 2023, an absolute beast. This card is awesome for high refresh rate gaming at 1080p and 1440p, and 60 to 100 FPS gaming at 4K. Not many CPUs can actually max out this card at 1080p, and while the AMD Ryzen 7 2700X cannot max out the card at 1080p and 1440p in most cases, it can do so at 4K, and it is more than enough to drive the card at 4K ultra settings 60 to 100 FPS, which is absolutely amazing. Having said that, the AMD Ryzen 5600G offers up to 40% better performance than 2700X at 1080p in certain situations, and can max out the card even at 1440p in most cases. Across our entire gaming test shoot, 5600G performed 24% better at 1080p, 19% better at 1440p, and 8% better at 4K. The results at 4K are quite similar as the games become GPU bound at that resolution, and that is true even with a very fast CPU as the RTX 3080 Ti. Even an older CPU like the 2700X can max out high-end cards and push 60 to 100 FPS at 4K, performing similarly to much newer and faster CPUs due to GPU limitation. The bottom line is that if you already have a 2700X and you're playing on a 60Hz display, then you have practically no need to upgrade your CPU. It is still quite plenty even for 4K 60fps gaming at ultra settings in 99% of all the modern AAA titles, and you can pair it even with an RTX 3080 Ti and equivalent cards like the RTX 4070 Ti and the AMD RX 6950 XT for 4K gaming without having a bottleneck in most cases. As for 1080p and 1440p gaming, the fastest CPU you should be pairing with the Ryzen 7 2700X would be something along the lines of the RTX 3080 and equivalent cards like the RTX 4070 or the AMD RX 6800 XT. Now, if you're gaming on a 144Hz display and you are looking to upgrade on a budget from 1st gen or 2nd gen Ryzen, or if you're still on an old DDR3 system, then just get a cheap-used AM4 B450 motherboard, 16GB of DDR4 RAM, and a 6-core 12-thread Ryzen 5 5500 or a 5600 and be happy. As we've seen in this video, the little Ryzen 5 5600G is nothing short of amazing, as it is powerful enough to max out even high-end cards like the RTX 3080 Ti at 1440p and 4K ultra settings, making this chip the budget king of PC gaming along with Intel's 12th and 13th gen Core i3 CPUs. These entry-level Zen 3 6-core 12-thread Ryzens have practically rendered obsolete all CPUs sold in the used market for over $80, and you just can't go wrong with them. The value they offer is simply amazing. And with that said, we have come to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, please leave a like and consider subscribing to our channel. Thanks for watching, have a nice day, and hope to see you in the next one.